Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue with this very exciting day with our next panel. For those of you tuning in for the first time on our live stream, I'm Evan Elkin, Executive Director of Reclaiming Futures. Welcome back to the 2015 Reclaiming Futures Leadership Institute, our annual national meeting where we bring leaders from within our community and national experts, innovators, thought leaders from the field of juvenile justice, public health, social justice, and youth development to talk about ways we can improve outcomes for youth. Reclaiming Futures is a national juvenile justice reform initiative designed to bring sound public health principles and effective treatment practices to juvenile justice and other youth-serving systems around the country. We just heard an amazing keynote address from James Bell, and I'm not going to stand up here any longer. I'm going to introduce James back to the podium, who will introduce our panel on pathways to equity in the juvenile justice system. Thanks again. Here's James.
Good morning again. I'm not going to say much because you were subjected to me for about 45 minutes, but I do want to introduce this panel. We are going to have our three panelists whose bios are in the materials. We're going to first start off with Angela Irvine, then we're going to go to Monique Morris, and then we're going to go to Ken Hardy, and they will tell you what parts of equity they're going to be addressing. And here's the play sheet. Since we have theater people, this is the playbill. 20 minutes each, which will leave you a half hour for questions and answers, which I think should be enough. I will be the timekeeper. I will step away while they do their thing. They're grown-ups, and they know their time, and you guys will then have questions and answers. We're going to start off with a colleague and a good friend, Angela Irvine.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming down to San Diego. So I'm going to talk a little bit in a little more detail about trends in de-incarceration over the last 10 years in a way that will echo and reinforce some of the things that James said earlier. We're at this incredible moment in a lot of ways in the juvenile justice system. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a reduction of 41% in juvenile incarceration. And the reasons for that are many. States like Ohio, Illinois, California all passed legislation that made status offenses and misdemeanors ineligible for state secure facilities. California in particular was very successful. We passed a bill that set it up so that only serious violent and sex offenses can be sent to our central state secure facility. And so as a result of that change, 10 years ago, we had 10,000 youth in our state secure facility. We had 13 facilities. We now have 600 youth in the state secure facilities, and we only have 2 facilities that are open. According to David Muhammad, who I don't know if he's in the room anymore, 300 of those youth are youth who were tried as adults, so we actually only have 300 youth that were tried in the juvenile court system. It's an incredible success. Those youth were not transferred to county facilities. So our county facilities have an 8,000 to 10,000 bed capacity. We have about 4,000 youth in county facilities right now. So if you think about that, we basically have gone from about 20,000 youth who were incarcerated to now over about 4,500. So we're at about 25% of where we were 10 years ago. So legislation has been incredibly successful. We have other reforms, like in New York, close to home reforms that brought youth from state secure facilities to group homes in the city. We have reforms that have really pushed youth from detention facilities and ranches and camps into community supervision. It's been incredibly successful, and at the same time, if you look at the kids that are still in those secure facilities, if you look at the kids who are in out-of-home placement, in secure facilities, or on probation, the proportion of youth of color keeps increasing. So 10 years ago, we had, if you look at dispositions in 5 different counties, so we did a study, we looked at Dallas, Birmingham, Alabama, Oakland, California, Peoria, and Akron. If you look across those 5 counties, 66% of youth receiving dispositions to probation, out-of-home placement, secure facilities were youth of color in 2002. In 2012, 81% of youth receiving those dispositions were youth of color. And what's interesting is that the proportion of Latino youth actually stayed the same at about 15%. So that increase was almost entirely on the backs of black kids. So that was a 15% increase in disproportionality for black youth. More recently, we've conducted a statewide survey of all the detention halls, ranches, and camps in California, and some really interesting findings came out of that. We found that 90% of youth that are in our facilities are youth of color. We found that 20% of those youth are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or gender nonconforming. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the LGBT research, about 7 to 8% of the general population of youth are LGBT or gender nonconforming. So that means we have a 2 to 3 times rate, a proportion of overrepresentation for LGBT youth. That is even more dramatic for girls. So if you disaggregate girls versus boys, about 50% of girls in the California system are lesbian, bisexual, questioning, or gender nonconforming, which has huge implications for specific areas such as our concern about trafficking and the sexual exploitation of youth. So if you think about if 50% of girls in this state are LBQ or gender nonconforming, and at the same time, that population is twice as likely to be picked up for a prostitution charge, which means that within that population, within that CSEC population, we actually have more lesbian, bisexual, and questioning girls, gender nonconforming girls, than straight girls. Huge implications for all of the human trafficking task forces, all of the special programs that DA, the HEAT program in Oakland, because we have to address many aspects of young people's identity at once to really address those kids who are still incarcerated, right? We have to think about, at the same time, we have to think about race, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, among other aspects of identity, such as immigration, language, et cetera. Now, how do we start to unpack this knot? It's more challenging. It wasn't as difficult to take status offenders out of the system, although they're still there in many states. It wasn't as difficult to pass laws to get misdemeanants out of the system. What's really difficult is getting at sort of some of the aspects that James was talking about earlier, because around charging and around sentencing, we know that young people of color are getting charged up for the same behaviors as white kids, right? So how do you roll DAs back? How do you roll the police back in to treat youth of color the same way that we treat white young people? How do we take away gang enhancements? How do we find placements for kids that address all of the aspects of their identity, that provide culturally affirming programs for young people? It's really difficult. But in all of this huge knot that we're thinking about, behavioral health does play a really important role, and I want to talk about that in a little bit, for a little bit. When we think about rolling reclaiming futures back into the schools, we have the opportunity to really assess and identify mental health and substance abuse problems before young people enter the juvenile justice system. So that is I think, a really promising possibility. At the same time, we also have to think about the mental health and substance abuse, behavioral health government agencies in the same way that we think about the juvenile justice systems and the child welfare agencies. Lark Wong was at a meeting that James sponsored in Chicago. She works for SAMHSA, and she was saying that the behavioral health agencies have just as much potential for net widening for youth of color as the juvenile justice systems and the child welfare systems, that we have to think about sort of the what do I want to say? Basically structural racism within behavioral health agencies as well. We don't want to increase the number of youth of color who are, because they're being misassessed for mental health or substance abuse problems. And so it's really important that moving forward we find the right balance between correctly assessing what's going on behaviorally for young people, not over-punishing in particular young people or LBQ, GNCT youth. We need to work across systems, like James said. We need to have an intersectional lens. We need to think about all the different aspects of young people's identity. We also need to provide culturally affirming community-based programs. So we need to move funding from these state agencies into community-based organizations that have what Ruben Austria at Community Connections for Youth calls credible messengers, right? The staffing for community-based organizations need to come from the same life experiences as the young people that they're serving, and that includes formerly incarcerated people, that includes former system-involved people. Weaving all these four aspects together, I think, provides promise for us taking the next step in reducing the racial and ethnic disparities that we're faced with. So thank you. I'm going to pass the baton to Monique, who's going to talk about gender and girls.
Good morning. We're all present still? All right. So I want to just start by saying that largely in response to the lack of inclusion of women and girls in national discourses about racial equity and justice, I've co-founded an organization called the National Black Women's Justice Institute. And much of what we do is work in two buckets, one having to do with reducing the barriers to employment for formerly incarcerated women, and the other one having to do with interrupting school to confinement pathways for girls, particularly girls of color and black girls. And you'll notice that I don't necessarily use the language school to prison pipeline. And that's intentional, because I've written pretty extensively about the ways in which our pipeline framework renders such a linear perspective that we are not able to see all of the multiple pathways that lead girls, boys too, and other youth along the gender continuum into the justice system. But I'm going to spend some time sort of talking through these confinement pathways and really beginning to look at ways that we might begin to structure our own engagement around these issues. So I want to spend some time talking about this question of what happens when kids are affected by both education systems and justice systems. So when James was talking, he was saying we've got to think about ways that our systems work better together. But in order for us to work better together, part of what we do is assess the issue as is currently sort of constructed, right? We're sort of looking at the ways in which our institutions are working together or not. And I've spent several years looking at education systems or education programs in institutions that are detention centers or other carceral institutions, and co-constructing research through a participatory action lens with young women about their own experiences and their articulated needs around restructuring some of these programs and services. So I want to just sort of establish a framework on a couple of levels, one having to do with the recognition that the struggle to remove the vestiges of segregation has largely under-theorized what is happening or the separate and unequal treatment that our children receive when they are educated in institutions that are also correctional facilities. Okay? These schools in detention centers are often hyper-segregated schools, right? They're often being underserved in these spaces. And For our girls in many jurisdictions, particularly if there's an elevated consciousness about the need to be gender responsive and there's some language around that, there might be simultaneously overserved and underserved. And what I mean by that is a lot of folks will pack the room and line the room when we say we're going to talk about girls, because there's a general recognition that a lot of the emphasis on boys has rendered girls invisible, and so folks want to feel that they're being responsive to the needs of girls, and they come in the room and they talk about girls, and then at the same time they talk about the multiple ways in which their physical and mental health needs are being underserved, but they don't talk about the linkages between the mental and physical health needs and their educational needs, which are required for them to move forward in life, to get a job, to move beyond job and into career. And so, when we talk about what's happening with black girls, and we talk about what's happening on this question of gender, it's important for us to recognize, in general, the absence of information, okay? So that's why I start with saying, we have under-theorized this issue, okay? And that's a problem. But nationwide, I'll just start with saying black girls represent the fastest growing population in residential placement and secure confinement. The data that's come out of UCLA has shown that there are patterns of exclusionary discipline, the suspensions, the expulsions that disproportionately affect black girls. And when we talk about what's happening with black girls, we're often not talking about them being treated differently because they're behaving differently. Sometimes they're being treated differently because their language and actions are being interpreted differently. So in many cases, the exclusionary discipline is a function of certainly the zero tolerance policies, but even where we don't exercise that, in the places where people interpret their loud responses to certain things or their attitude as being a condition for them to be criminalized or reprimanded in a more severe way. And these, sort of subjective ways in which girls of color, black girls in particular, have been affected can push them out. I'll just use the language, right? We're pushing them out, and we're not responding to who's waiting for them on the other end. Okay, what's waiting for them on the other end? When much of my work has been largely with girls who are perceived as too loud and too defiant and too sexy to be in school. And all of these things are subjective interpretations of behavior and subjective interpretations of an identity, a student identity, a personal identity, that are informed by generations of misinterpreting black femininity and generations of misinterpreting girls of color expressing themselves. And much of what I have written probably over the last 3 years has been in defense of these girls, saying, to tell a girl she can't talk, that she can't speak up, is to basically strip her of a core part of her identity, because for generations, black women have spoken up. And the girls will tell you that. So in the research that I've been doing with the young women and co-constructing much of the responses to this underserved nature of their educational experience, the girls will say, well, if we see something happening, we've got to say something, right? And it doesn't matter what happens to me, because this is a cultural norm for them to speak up. Fannie Lou Hamer spoke up. Y'all know who that is, right? Okay, right? It's in the cultural tradition to speak. We're speaking in this room without reprimand, right? Elevating a consciousness that facilitates a different way to engage with the system that is recognized as being insufficient, recognized as being oppressive. And so in the work that I have done with the young women, much of what I've done is try to map with them some of the ways in which school has underserved them in these institutions, but also drawing the connections between their experiences pre-incarceration and what happens to them in these facilities, and then what happens to them when they come out. So I just want to share with you some of the findings from my own work with them, and then talk about it in the context of this practice or this discussion this morning around building equity. So quickly, I want to share that when you engage black girls, in particular, who were the co-constructors of this research and who were partners with me in exploring this inquiry, they care about their education. They care. So despite what we want to say about girls who are system involved, who may be underperforming, who may not necessarily, demonstrate through their grades that they care about education, they all recognize that it's an important function, and the vast majority say it's important or very important to them and their adult caregiver, okay? They have a history of exclusion and discipline in their district schools. So over 80% of the girls in the study that I conducted had a history of being suspended from school, and for many of these girls, like the case that you saw here earlier in James's presentation, were suspended at very early ages. So they were suspended for having tantrums. They were suspended for fighting. But the fights that were happening, I think many of us at age 6 or 7 might have gotten into a fight or two, okay, on a school grounds. A lot of it was about things that had been said to them, some of them racially motivated, some of them provoked by students, and some of them provoked by teachers, and some of them in response to other conditions in their lives that were beyond their control, and they just didn't have the tools to engage critically around assessing their level of pain. They experience exclusionary discipline while in detention. So one of the things that we don't talk about necessarily is the hyper-punitive way in which detention facilities then reinforce the trauma and reinforce these negative aspects of their identity once they are locked up. And we use, these sort of terms around detention and incarceration and jails and prisons as if they're different institutions, and we recognize the differences. But to the kids and to most of society, they're all one thing. Right? Incarceration is incarceration. If you talk to these young women about where they are, they'll say, we're in jail, period. All of it's jail. And so while we make these distinctions, we have to recognize the artificial nature of that distinction, okay? And so in doing that, we have to recognize that almost all of the girls in the study that I had talked to had been removed from their classroom in their detention facility, removed from the classroom. And so when we talk about the exclusionary discipline that's taking place out in the district schools, we also have to consider the ways in which the schools in the places that are determined to be rehabilitative or correctional are also excluding our girls. They're also pushing them out for things like asking questions. I thought that's what you were supposed to do in class, right? They thought that's what you were supposed to do in class. But if they ask a question and it's not perceived to be relevant, or if they ask a question and it's deemed to be disruptive, they risk the possibility of being removed from the classroom to sit out in the halls or sent back to their unit, right? And so what does that teach them about education, right? Again, many of these girls have had negative experiences in their district schools. And so what the punitive response to their questioning and the punitive response to their engagement in this process of learning in these facilities, does is reinforce this negative relationship that they have with school. And so later on, when you hear from Fania and others who are going to talk about restorative practices, we often talk about this restoring of relationship between individuals. And part of what my work has been to do is to also encourage us to establish a way to reconnect and rebuild relationship with institutions, with the idea of education, with this consciousness that has facilitated their criminalization, okay, and the multiple practices that do that as well. They have drug use and dependency issues, not news to this crowd, right? And many of the girls I want to share, had certainly admitted a history of smoking marijuana and going to school high, and in my conversations with them, I asked them, so what happens, right, when you show up at school? And the majority of the girls would say things like, well, nothing, or I get sent home, right? Nothing or sent home. Both of those are insufficient responses, to say the least, right? And so when the young women are engaged in this, sort of process of self-discovery, sort of trying to mask their pain, trying to understand where they go next, many of them are showing up high. Many of them will show up in clothes that are, not in keeping with the dress code. And some of them will then be responded to as if they're provoking this kind of behavior. Their behavior is interpreted as being manipulative. There's this sort of overlay of sexist and patriarchal interpretation of their behaviors that for them says, okay, fine, if this is the condition that I live in, then this is how I'll work it, right? This is how I'll play with that. I can show up at school and I can show up high, I can show up in the short shorts, I can show up in the half shirt. I know I'll be sent home where I can go get high, right? Or I'll go back to my pimp, right? And we have to be, as practitioners and as people who care and love for these children, aware that we've set up this zero-sum, dichotomous, no-win situation and structure for our girls when we're not prepared to receive them when they show up to school. When we're not prepared to structure our programs and interventions when we do have them in institutions, if they're there, where many of them don't need to be, right? But if they're there, what are we doing while they're there? Are we working to repair these relationships, or are we reinforcing this climate of punishment and exclusion? Many of the girls, I'll say, have not been engaged in their curriculum, so the work they don't perceive to be very challenging, not surprising. You know, in many juvenile detention centers, the schoolwork that they receive is very easy to them. They get packets, and they kind of walk through the packets and they say, okay, fine, I'll detach today, or they'll engage in ways that they feel they need to. But many of our educators in these facilities are not equipped to really respond to the level of trauma and abuse that these girls have dealt with, and the educators are not equipped to help them build relationships with school and understanding why school is relevant to their career and job objectives. So, you know, in my conversations with girls, they know what they want to do in life. They have an idea of, you know, what they want to do, and it's certainly not what they're currently doing. They don't necessarily want to go out and rob somebody, but they do want to make money. And you know, when I talk to the girls who do rob that person at gunpoint, it's largely because they felt like they needed some money and they want to be CEO of a business someday, right? Or they want to be a lawyer, but they have no idea how to get there. They don't know if they can ever get there now, right? And so there has been this disconnect between what they're professing as a desire to do and what they want to do with their lives. So what does that mean for us? So I have, you know, been working with a team to say, all right, if we know this information about our girls and they're willing to share this with us in a meaningful way, then we certainly need to use that, you know, put that to good use, right? So I'm in the process now of working with a team to develop a pilot reentry program for girls that will look at treating their education not just as an important response to their condition of confinement or their reentry to our communities, but also as a practice of social justice. We have underserved and rendered girls invisible to the extent that they have a very difficult time even centering themselves in conversations about justice reform. So let me say that again. When I talk to girls about what is going on in their lives, we have so conditioned in the public domain a conversation about men and boys that they have trouble centering themselves in a conversation about justice, okay? And so part of what we're seeking to do in this quest to repair relationship is to move beyond this very linear way that we understand justice, this linear way that we have structured reforms based upon the experiences of males, and also incorporate and be inclusive of the conditions that are rendering many of our girls and other youth along the gender continuum invisible in this conversation. We talk a lot about trauma and healing in our spaces, but we have to recognize that to be ignored is traumatic. We have to recognize that to be consistently left out of a conversation is producing a consciousness that accepts the invisibility of the populations we don't name, the trans populations that we don't name, the LGBTQ populations that we don't name, the Black girls, the Latina girls, the Asian girls that we don't name. We see their pictures. Many of the most egregious cases of school discipline that render girls invisible or that render youth criminalized include girls. But we don't say their names. We don't rally. We don't protest. We don't structure programs and interventions that require that to be gender responsive is also culturally competent, because you can't be one without the other. We don't push ourselves as practitioners to engage in an equity conversation that is authentic and built upon the conditions and in response to the needs of the population that's affected. And that's the reason why, even in our research agenda, right? We have scholars and practitioners in this space. We have to be action-oriented and participatory in our methods because their experiences, they are living with this expertise. They know what they need when we ask them. Our society likes to believe that adults have all the answers, but we don't, as James was saying, right? So when we talk about this equity agenda, and the title of this panel is Pathways to Equity. I wanted to go back and say, well, what is this equity lens, right? What are we saying we want, right? When we mention trauma, and we talk about intersectional and inclusive responses, what are we talking about? We have to understand that the historical trauma and racism are really reflected in the systems of bias, not just in our own individual implicit bias, but in our structural manifestations of programs and understandings, even in our construct of gender. So when we say, okay, we're gonna have a gender-responsive program for girls, maybe this girl was involved, was on foster care. This is actually the case. I ran into a girl who was in foster care who identified currently as a girl, but what she said to me in our interviews was, they keep, I'm in this gender-responsive program and they keep putting me with the women, but, I always felt this connection with the men. So, how come I have to be with the women? And, I was like, what does that mean? Talk to me more about what you would want to see. And she was like, well, I always get along with the men. And then as we started to continue our conversation, she was like, I dress like a man. And she was like, but I have to be with the women, and that's not really where I want to be. And our own limitations around our understanding of gender, our understandings of an operation as if we live in a gender binary, right, as if there's only male and female, have limited our own ability to respond to the true needs of kids who may not identify as either, or who may identify as both, or who really just want to be with the person that they connect to emotionally best, rather than be stuck in a system that is so inflexible that they cannot move with authenticity and integrity. And that's hard for us to wrap our brains around because we live in a society that so reinforces a gender binary and that so requires us to move with girls responsive, boys responsive, that we don't push ourselves to that next level for the kids who need it, which is partly why we see this level of kids who are self-medicating, right, who are excluded and pushed out from their families, and whose programs are underserving them to the extent that they are criminalized and in our institutions. And the other thing I want to say is, part of what we're tasked to do, I think, in this equity conversation is have an honest conversation about oppression. And, when we talk, much of James' presentation this morning outlined elements of oppression that I think we could absolutely elevate in this space, sort of looking at this identity of age, the ways in which age compression, or this practice of rendering youth as older than they actually are, or this denial of youth of color an opportunity to be children, sort of negatively impacts their psyche. But it's also important for us to think through the ways in which our own interactions with young people reinforce that oppression. Our ways of telling them, you don't know what's best for you. Our own ways of saying, let's talk about how you stand over there and you say these things when we call ourselves prepping young people so that they say the things that we want them to say, not necessarily the things that are sitting on their hearts, or the ways in which we have conversations without them continuously, without engaging their voices and elevating them in a space that will give them the power to reclaim themselves, right? To understand their own humanity. Because many of us no longer want to hear, I'm sure everyone in this room no longer wants to hear a 10-year-old girl refer to herself as a prostitute or a hoe, right? We want to hear our children referring to themselves as who they actually are, right? Beautiful, anointed, loved human beings, right? Who have all the promise in the world, but for a grave system of oppression that has rendered them voiceless and in many ways without opportunity. Voiceless and without opportunity does not mean spiritless and without promise. And so as we structure our engagements to think through how we can increase the rigor of our understanding of gender, increase our rigor around the understanding of what it means to be culturally competent, increase our rigor around what it means to integrate the two such that our discourses nationally and programmatically are reflective of a continued interrogation of what these two mean in our practice, that is the anti-oppression work that we're trying to do when we then say, okay, now let's talk about the behavioral health conditions that will keep our children safe and will redefine safety, right? That will help us understand what needs to happen in their lives for them to feel whole. Because our institutions, though we call them corrective and rehabilitative, they're actually very punitive, and I think we know that. But we also have to recognize that in our work around developing a safe space for young people and with young people, the core of that is anti-oppression work. It's about deconstructing the isms that keep them voiceless and powerless. And that's our work. So I'll pause.
Good morning. I realize it's probably getting old by now, but it's the first time I've had a chance to greet you. My name is Kenneth Hardy, and I tell you, I'm just so extraordinarily honored and privileged to be a part of this panel. When Evan first reached out to me, I was very excited about this. And I have to admit, James, that during your talk this morning, I probably missed about 10 or 15 minutes of it after you invited us to reflect on things that we had done as kids. That I immediately went into a state of disassociation. So I'm not sure what you said after that, but it was very powerful. And I want to say that part of my excitement to be here is that this topic area in general is one that is near and dear to my own heart. I mean, it's long since ceased to be a mere matter of professional interest for me, that it feels very personal to me. And in fact, many of the issues that we're talking about here today, and even during your talk, Monique, I was just felt visceral reaction to what you were talking about, because all of these issues are in many ways on the street where I live. And I have this sort of dual life as an academician, but also work as a therapist. And so there's a way in which these issues are inescapable. Just last, actually yesterday morning, I had a kid come in, 14 years old, and we've been having these conversations about race, and he's in and out of the judicial system, and with this appropriate sense of rage, and I think he'd gotten this from social media, but he said, before he said, good afternoon, Doc, see, this is what I'm talking about. And so he shows me a picture of Dylan Roof, and he said, this is what it looks like when you kill 9 people. And then my practice is in New York, and then he shows me a picture of Eric Gardner. And this is what it looks like for having 3 Lucys. And in some ways, that discourse was so central to the issues of which we're talking about here. And I do think that there's a way in which that all of these systems of care that we interface with have this way of unwittingly dividing kids into these sort of seemingly 3 discrete groups, and that is, and I think you alluded to some of this, but that's good kids, bad kids, and mad kids. And the kids who are good are usually the kids that we want to emulate. And the bad kids are those who get punished and we want to incarcerate. And then, of course, the mad kids are those that we medicate. And I know it's probably politically incorrect to say, but I also think that that these divisions really break down along racial lines. And so that oftentimes that the mad kids who are worthy of medication are white kids. And that bad kids categorically, systematically, repetitively are kids of color. And there's a way in which that we seldom see any kind of character development, if you will, of kids of color who do bad things. That with this sort of paradigm that we use of good, bad, and mad, it seems to deceive us and seduce us away from understanding that it is possible. I think it's possible for good kids to do bad things and for bad kids to do good things. And because this is so rigidified that we can't wrap our heads around these nuances in a way that we think about it. And so I do believe that that many of the kids, many of the children that are in all of these systems, whether it's school or juvenile justice systems, are kids who have just disproportionately have had brushes with various kinds of trauma in their lives. And I've been so grateful that this terminology of trauma, if you will, has permeated our existence in the way that it has, because quite frankly, in a very selfish way, it's afforded people like myself an opportunity to give voice to issues that are otherwise very difficult to talk about in society. And so that if anyone who's a student of trauma and understands the nuances of trauma, that there's hypervigilance associated with trauma, that there's a difficulty in regulating one's emotions, that basically the human body is equipped with that which is analogous to a thermostat, the very type of thermostat that keeps the temperature in this room regulated for us. If it gets too hot, the air conditioning kicks on. If it gets too cold, it kicks off, that it helps us to regulate. And so in the human body, that we have a regulatory system. And what we understand about trauma is that trauma destroys our self-regulatory system. And we understand that as long as we talk about trauma in a very generic way. But the thing I believe is that there's a time now that we need to sort of expand our notion of trauma to include what I'm sort of referring to in my own writing and work as sociocultural trauma. And sociocultural trauma has to do very much with our location in society. And that so many of us are situated and located in circumstances that predispose us to trauma without the trauma ever being named or recognized. And so I appreciated just your point, Monique, about just the fact that we don't name experiences with girls, we don't name them. And so there's something about the worst debilitating disorder, the most debilitating condition that one can ever suffer from is a condition that is not named, because if it's not named, it's not acknowledged. If it's not acknowledged, it's not validated. If it's not validated, it doesn't exist, and so there's no treatment for it. And so there's a way in which that I don't think that we have to eradicate the current notions we have about trauma generically, but I think we do need to expand our notion of trauma to include sociocultural trauma. Because the fact of the matter is that even, forget about race for a moment, but if you just think about, and you touched on this, think about those of us in the room who were born into circumstances where lower income poverty was a reality of our lives. That there's something fundamental about poverty, is that it's a very complicated, multifaceted phenomenon. That yes, I believe that, that those who are poor become the beacons of creativity. That I think there's a way in which poverty teaches us valuable lessons about the importance of falling down and getting up again, that resilience. But there's another side of poverty, which is that it lacerates the soul, that it destroys in part, it attacks the psyche. And that when you grow up poor, and you grow around other people who are poor, that you never think of yourself as poor. That whatever you do that's associated with poor is just what you do. So that fried bologna sandwich you have, you don't think about that as poor cuisine, you think about that as good cuisine. And this ability to make sandwiches out of anything that's before you, apple butter, sugar, mustard, mayonnaise, it's just what you do. It's not bad cuisine, it's not poor cuisine, it's just cuisine. But something very powerful happens. Something very powerful happens when we wander outside of our particular milieu. And for many of us, school becomes a place where that happens. If anyone here who was not born in this country, but not born poor, you've had this experience as an immigrant. You go to school and you take out your lunch and you're sitting in the lunch in the cafeteria. And what the very exposure of your lunch engenders is not just a healthy curiosity about what is that, but it's a curiosity laced with disdain. What is that? You eat that? And from that point forward, you learn not to take your lunch to school. But more importantly, it's your first introduction to shame that's associated with poverty. And so you're asking yourself now, what does apple butter sandwiches have to do with why we're convened here? Here's the connecting point. Here's the connective tissue. That I think that so many of our young people, and particularly young people of color, and I'm putting in more specifically black youth, are exposed to many elements of trauma, classical trauma like any other kid. So in one sense, that black kids are like all other kids, but like no other kids. I'm sorry, but like all other kids, some other kids, but no other children. And so in addition to the trauma, the wounds that come along with abandonment, neglect, over hyperexposure to violence and so forth, that could malign the lives of any child, that black children and children of color also have the additional burden of dealing with sociocultural trauma, and a particular trauma that is not named. And so what happens is this unnamed condition leaves many black kids and many kids of color with these invisible trauma wounds that we never see, but simply organizes their lives. And so what I believe is that many children of color, and the thing, as a child, it always intrigued me. I thought it was an act of magic when I watched like a pit bull or dog in the backyard of a home. And a dog had that invisible fence. And as a young kid, it seemed absolutely astounding to me that this ferocious pit bull would run to the edge of the yard and stop. And run, stop. It seemed magical, my gosh, that it knew its boundaries. But here's the sad part. Many kids of color live lives behind these same invincible fences. They understand at a very early age that a part of the socialization process is for them to know their place. And their place is a very restrictive place. It's a place that does to children what should never, ever happen to any child on the planet. That is, it's a place where your dreams, their hopes, get an expiration date affixed to them. And you show me a child whose dreams and ambitions carry an expiration date, and I'll show you a child that's headed for incarceration. And for too many of our children, that happens. And so part of my disassociation today with James was when he said, what things you've done. I don't create any illusion with the kids I work with and say, you know what, don't be fooled by the finely cut, tailored Italian suit. Don't let the tie distract you. Don't let the $50 words distract you. I am you. I was one step away from where you are. And I think that's true of many of us in this room. And so what I believe is these invisible wounds that our kids have to deal with that never get seen, and I think this is so true of the community in and of itself, is that, for what I want to talk about very quickly, that this wound around devaluation, humiliation, that I think is very difficult for kids of color to grow up in our society. And I think it's true for those of us in the room who are people of color, that we're just older versions of those we serve. That to without having the exposure of devaluation and humiliation. And what devaluation is, it's a process by which the core of your dignity gets assaulted. And so when you're exposed to devaluation, and what I'm suggesting is that kids of color have multiple layers of exposure, because it's something devaluing about family breakdown. It's something devaluing about growing up poor. But there's also the way in which we live in a society that devalues the experience of people of color. And so that when you are devalued, all aspects of your life and living are devalued, in birth and death. And so devaluation is that it cuts at the core of one's dignity. And when one's dignity is assaulted, that there's a very high premium placed on respect. So much so that respect becomes that which you are willing to die for. And we might ask ourselves, who among us would be so incredibly fragile and superficial that you're willing to die for respect? And the answer is quite simple. For those for whom respect is hard to get. And so I understand when the Latino kid from the barrio or from the Bronx, New York, or the black kid from Harlem says, you know what, Doc, I'm sorry, but I'd rather die than be dissed. And so we're outraged to hear that because, at my age, I'm trying to do every possible thing I can to add another 5 minutes to my life, and then to sit here with a kid who has already cut a deal, who already understands, has made this deal that he recognizes that the untimeliness of his death is impending. And so it motivates, it haunts us. We don't know what to do. And yet, so there's devaluation, and wherever devaluation is, there is also exposure to shame. And there's no emotion in our emotional repertoire that is as damaging and debilitating and crippling and paralyzing as is shame. Shame is so incredibly debilitating that it's shameful to even acknowledge that you have shame. And so when you experience this wound of devaluation and shame, that what it does is it creates a kind of assaulted sense of self. It's hard to get a clear sense about who I am, because somehow all the noise out there about who I am I criminal, am I thug, is in my head. I don't have a clear sense about who I am. And so there's a way in which so many of our young people suffer from this wound of devaluation. And what the pathway to prison, oftentimes, the pathway to incarceration, is some act that the person has perpetrated that ultimately is designed to get respect. So, because the rule around devaluation of respect is, if I have to disrespect to get respect, the disrespect that I've perpetrated doesn't matter, because the end justifies the means. And so not only is there this wound around devaluation, but there's also a kind of this second invisible trauma wound that really constitutes the focal point of my work, and should constitute the focal point of the systems in which we work, is around this erosion of community. And James mentioned community in his talk, and so for me, this community, I'm really thinking about it as a metaphor. It's almost like a psychological concept. It's about our ability for relational connectedness. And so when our sense of community is disrupted, that it's very difficult to have a sense of conscience and consciousness in the absence of community. And so what I believe is so many of our young people, there are 3 levels of community, I think, that are so incredibly important in the lives and well-being of young people. And there's primary community, which refers to family, however one defines that. There's the extended community, which refers to the activities and groups that young people participate in that help them make the necessary transformation from me to we, to be a part of something greater than themselves. And then there's cultural community, and that's where one gets a sense of clarity about who I am and what it means to be who I am. And what I'm suggesting is that for many black youth, many kids of color, that their sense of community is massively disrupted, And kids seem to do okay if one level of this community remains relatively intact, that it serves as a powerful mediating factor for the other 2. But when all 3 are simultaneously disrupted, so you get a kid who's there where there's family disruption, and there's an aggravated or estranged relationship with school, and then there's also this lack of clarity about who I am, that disrupts a kid's sense of community. And so what I believe is that we have plenty of black and brown kids walking around today who are psychologically homeless, that many of them have roof, heat, hot water, but existentially, spiritually, psychologically homeless. And when you're psychologically homeless, that you are trapped in a pathway where you're looking for something, this incessant seeking and searching for an elusive something else. And you can't find it because it's not clear what you're looking for. And so there's a way in which, that penal institutions, jail, prisons, incarceration, provides that home, if you will, unfortunately. But unfortunately, that, like a kid I worked with, did some consulting with down in the state of Florida, just went to jail, broke my heart, cried nights about it, young little Puerto Rican boy. At 4 years old, he was sleeping in cars in Newark, New Jersey, moved to Florida. By the time he was 14-year-old, 34 foster placements. That you look at his record, FTA, 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 failure to adjust. I ask, who's failure to adjust? You got a kid who's never had any semblance of a family, bounced from institution to institution, but yet it's his failure to adjust, not the institutions who should have, whose responsibility was to find a way to incorporate him. So, in the state of Florida, just received 35 years prison. 35 years prison. And he'll get out to be a middle-aged version of who he went in to be. Because the wounds that he carried, that he take inside that institution, will be the wounds that he'll come out with, because there's no provisions within that context to even address his wounds. But not only is there devaluation and this erosion of community, But I would just, if we conducted any kind of research in any juvenile detention center or prison, and I've actually done this, that what you would find for young kids of color and older versions of that, the ways in which their lives have been inundated with losses. And so that, and it's not just that they have had losses, but the losses for the most part have remained unacknowledged, unmourned, ungrieved losses. Because what happens is that when you are devalued, all aspects of your life are devalued. And so that these trauma wounds that are associated with loss are really around dehumanized loss. It's when loss becomes dehumanized. And what happens is that when you're exposed to repetitive loss after loss after loss, and there's no mourning for loss, the loss loses its humanness. And so so many of our young people have this wide, vast myriad of intangible losses, because I think that they're intangible and tangible. And we don't see the tangible losses. And I mean, we know that we can acknowledge in the lives of Black and Latino kids that their fathers are missing. So we recognize that's the tangible loss. But beyond that, we turn a blind eye toward the intangible losses. What it must mean to be 14, what it must mean to be 6 or 7 and already have to endure the loss of dignity, the loss of hope, the loss of innocence, the loss of future orientation. Like, I don't think we've even begun to contemplate what these weekly displays of unarmed Black men lying in the streets all over this country in the pools of their own blood, how it's impacting the psyche of young people. I know it's fucking me up, I know that. And I know when I travel around this country and I meet that there's not a single Black mother in an audience I ever meet who says, I don't know, I just had a woman like that, a clinical psychologist, very well published, said, I don't know how to protect my son. I don't know how to do that. And the question I ask is, what is the name of the pain that many Black people feel now watching these indignities on a daily basis? There's no, and in my profession, we love coming up with syndromes and disorders and conditions, but we haven't come up with a name for this. What is the name when you're relegated to the sidelines of watching this incredible pain that happens on a daily basis? And so finally, another invisible wound that's attached to trauma. And James, I know this one, used the term anger, and I think there is anger, but the term I prefer is rage. That there's no way to have, to suffer from your dignity being assaulted, being perpetually and systematically devalued, and not have rage. And what rage is a much more primitive emotion than anger. Rage is inextricably tied to experiences of degradation and marginalization. You show me anybody who has experienced marginalization, and I'll show you someone who has rage. But rage, and the goal with rage is that we can lock it up, but we can't eradicate it, because you can't eradicate it as long as the conditions responsible for rage continue to persist. And so my goal is always with young Black boys, and particularly young Black people and people of color, is to find some vehicle for that rage, because I think that rage is like love in a sense. It's an energy source. It can propel us to the depths of our greatness, or it can destroy us. And so I understand, I'm coming here before you today with a tremendous amount of rage, but I also tell you that the microphone is my Uzi. And so we can use it to build bridges across a great divide, or we can use it to destroy. And so what this means for systems of care, I think, is to move more toward trauma-informed, and not just as a banner, as a slogan, but there's a way in which we enhance our sense of consciousness about what are the invisible wounds that so many marginalized kids carry. And until we address those wounds, that we can't possibly ever understand the complete anatomy of their existence. And so I think that systems of care really should be devoted to whatever they do, continue to do whatever they've always done, but they also have to build in mechanisms to counteract devaluation, because I don't care whether you have Malia Obama or Tamika from the hood, that they share a complexion in common, and this society has an adverse reaction to Black skin and people of color. And so there's a way in which that her being the daughter of the most powerful person in the free world doesn't protect her from the kinds of things that you talked about. And so there's a way in which these systems, we have to build this into these systems. Secondly, there has to be some effort to, conscious effort to restore community. And when I talk about restore community, I'm talking about build relationships, because I think it's the wisdom of young black people. It's amazing to me that I think it makes a difference. When I was a young boy, I referred to my home as my crib. You coming over to my crib? We'll meet at your crib. Young people now refer to my hood. I think the language is powerful, because crib is where you're nurtured. Crib is where you're provided for. Hood, what's missing from hood? What they're referring to is the place where they live, but what's missing from hood? Neighborhood, because somehow that piece of connection has been disrupted. And then finally, I think also some attention to loss, and then it has to be some vehicles for rechanneling rage, not eradicating rage, not incarcerating rage, not puncturing rage, but rechanneling rage. And then finally, I'll just say this, I'm really going to get off. And so the final thing is a message for us, because I think that I always want a piece in it for us as providers, because I think that this work, I feel a sense of urgency around this work. And I feel like I have lots of privileges in my life, and I don't have time even here to sit around and contemplate and cogitate, because on our watch this very moment, this young kid is holding a bullet right now. And so what I believe that the work does, it requires each of us to make a conscious decision about who it is and how it is that we want to be. Because I think that there are minimally at least 3 roles for us to play. That, and I always say that we can make some conscious decisions about whether we are aspiring healers, helpers, or jailers. And I know that when it comes to young people, and particularly young people of color, we're all being massively, aggressively recruited to be the jailers in the lives of young people, when in fact they need us to be healers. And so we think, what is the jailer? The jailer is that person who's concerned about perpetuation of the status quo. What is the familiar refrain of the jailer is? Look, I don't make the rules, I'm just trying to do my job. Well, you know what? In this case, maybe simply doing your job ain't enough. And so the helper's always there to pick up the pieces after they shatter, after they fall apart. But the helper doesn't do a damn thing to prevent the pieces from falling apart. And so I suspect we need all of these roles in our society. But then there's the healer. The healer looks at the situation and said, look, what is not good enough, what is not the way it has to be, who is concerned about transforming the human condition, about attending to issues of social justice, who looks at how do we break down the walls of oppression, degradation, and domination. And so my thing is, after this conference, after we're all enlightened and inspired, we go back to our place of work, that there's a key holder there with 3 metaphorical key holder with 3 keys: helper, healer, jailer. My question is, which key do we choose? I sure as hell hope we all choose the key of healer. Thank you very much.
Wow. Yeah, when I was coming up, we used to say, damn, that was deep. This entire panel was deep. Congratulations, Reclaiming Futures. Wow. For bringing this together. I run an organization, and we have a staff meeting every month, and I know you guys know what that world looks like. And as the manager of the organization, I'm the boss. It's hard for me to say that since I've been a worker all my life, but now I'm a boss. And so the goal of the boss is to actually have the staff meeting go quickly, and all the issues happen, and we just move on. And there's this impulse whenever something uncomfortable comes up to reschedule it for later. Because we know it's uncomfortable, and it's going to throw our whole agenda off. And what we gonna do? This morning, we have heard so much information. What a privilege we have had to get this kind of information, and some of it is uncomfortable. And what I have learned as a boss is put the agenda aside and pay attention to the uncomfortable. Because if you keep putting the uncomfortable off, it's gonna bite you in the butt in ways that are harder to manage. And so I just hope that we understand, for those in the room where discomfort makes you uncomfortable, uncomfortable is good in these issues. And so I want to thank the panelists for raising issues in the way that they have. Angela for talking about decarceration and the community of LGBTQ people and where that is in our population. Monique, this whole question of invisibility and unnamed. And Dr. Hardy, I tell you, for this whole point of psychologically homeless was just, I pulled out my damn thing, started typing on it. So all of that was very good. And so now we're going to open it up to questions for these incredible folk. Preguntas.
The thing that comes to mind right away for me, with this being a behavioral health conference, is for us to think about punishment within the context of healing and health, and for I think it's really important. I know that oftentimes young people will not access behavioral health services without them being court mandated, but they also become a major reason why young people pick up probation violations and get pulled into the juvenile justice system for many years. And so what I would ask the audience is that we all think about becoming advocates for separating out access to services and making those services court mandated, so that we can really focus on healing and take the punishment out of that healing process.
I'm also thinking that that at a real practical level, changing the types of conversations that we have, so that while it may be important to talk with young people about their, and I'm thinking largely of kids of color, about their antisocial proclivities, it's also important to create space to have some acknowledge and have them talk about the ways in which society is anti-them. Because I think that those kind of conversations seldom, if ever, get much traction. And by extension, just my bias is I think there has to be some real hard conversations about these sociocultural dimensions. And I think that in our society, that race is hard to talk about in every possible venue. And I just think that when working with young kids of color, if somehow the intervention processes or efforts to rehabilitate doesn't include, if there's not space to talk about race and in a real meaningful way, then I think it falls short of meeting the needs that many young people have. I think that's important.
Yeah, I would just say probably 4 things I've written down in response to that question. Because one of the things that I'm asked often is, you talk about girls, I usually get this question from men, what do I as a man have to say about what's going on with girls? And often, in my generation, we say, speak on it, right? And, often we say we can't speak on things because we don't feel a connection to that community. And my response is, we must speak on it. Right? So actively engage and adopt a consciousness that will facilitate speaking on the issue, even if you don't feel personally connected, elevate it in such a way that allows for others who may be connected to insert and engage. The second thing is to use a framework. We talk a lot about trauma, and I think it's important to emphasize trauma, but there's a growing movement to emphasize the healing component of that, such that our programming and responses are not trauma-informed, but actually healing-informed, so that we take a more appreciative lens and a more collective and collaborative orientation to our anti-oppression work. The third thing is to assess the programs, assess your current programs and practices for intersections between being both gender responsive and culturally competent. We tend to use the two as if they're not necessarily connected. And I mentioned it, just in my brief comments, how we must begin to think about them as so intrinsically connected that you can't talk about one without talking about the other. It's not gender responsive unless it's culturally competent. It's not culturally competent unless it's gender responsive, in a way that allows for us to understand the complexities of gender, but also that allows us to deeply interrogate in an ongoing way the effectiveness of our programming and interventions and strategies, et cetera. The last thing I'll say is that I think it's important for us to engage in participatory evaluation methods. So when we're assessing effectiveness of our programs and we're talking about what we're doing well in our communities and we're talking about how we're serving young people and we're talking about the organizations that we're working with, it's important for us to develop structures and adopt methods that allow for the centering and expertise of the young people that we are working with to be an active, critical part of our understanding of whether or not we are being effective. Okay, so these are simple things that I think we can begin to do. Some of them not so simple. The engagement between the gender responsive, culturally competent is actually really hard work. But it's important for us. I do. But it's important for us to do those things.
So I would add to this conversation in terms of how do we go from what we hear here to the practical. And oftentimes, many of us, we go to conferences as meetings, and it's like, okay, these things inspire something. But we see, okay, that was that. So the conference has its own culture, right? You go to dinner, you have one more drink than you normally have, and you go out and do stuff that you normally wouldn't do. Okay, that's what conference is. And you hear some inspiring stuff. And then you go home, and then there's my job. And these two cannot exist like that anymore. I don't know your job, you do. Something said here today, so what we think our jobs are is these conferences are aspirational and inspirational and what a great idea, and I want 85 Ken Hardys. I want 85 Moniques and Angelas. No, actually, you ever been to a dinner party and you ask people what they do and somebody goes, well, I'm just a school teacher. Just a school teacher. That's the most powerful job on the planet. What do you mean you're just a school teacher? So whatever your job is, bring these principles to how you do your work. Because so many people in the justice system feel that their jobs are limited. My job won't let me do what these panelists said. Actually, you're wrong. Your job is what you do it to be. Your job is how you change. So if actually, before this conference, when you defined your job as this, after this conference, add to the job. Bring in some component that was an idea brought here today, and you know better than me how to get that into your job without being insubordinate. Because you got to keep that paycheck coming. We know that. That's job one. Keep that cheddar flowing. But there are ways that you can do these jobs, and people in the justice system are so self-limiting. Ken hit on it. Well, we just take who they give us. This is what they told us. It's the most helpless, lame field going. Well, we can't do this, and we'll get in trouble if we do that. Take these ideas, and you can think right now on your plane or your drive going home, actually, I could add these two things to my job that will make a big difference. When a kid comes and starts getting all attitudinal and throwing F-bombs at me and stuff, rather than writing failure to adjust, defiant, I'm going to say, okay, get it out your system, throw as many as you want. But we're going to talk today. I don't know how to do your job, you do. But these ideas, I can tell you, I'm going to do my job different after hearing this. We have time for more questions. What I would say to you is, actually, in many of these communities, there isn't much separation between perpetrator and victim. That's what I would say. It actually can be intrafamilial. It actually can be, as we say in our office, one day you're the windshield, the next day you're the bug, because it just, the line is so much finer, and so that this is for everybody. And my remarks around equity gives you community safety a better opportunity. So I'm just trying to plumb to make sure that we get the question. Something in our remarks, in mine and the panel's remarks, made you feel like victims were left out? I'm sure the panelists didn't mean that, so let's address that now. I'm gonna turn it over to folk. Thank you for that question.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank you.
it.
I was actually going to say the same thing that James, you just said, which is essentially that, you know, in my work, as I have observed, you know, for the decades that I've been engaged in this work, a very blurry line between perpetrator and victim, and that when I'm talking about the conditions of girls, in my examples, who have been exploited and trafficked, which to me is interchangeable with victim, and also those who have been incarcerated for harming others, like the example I gave of the girl who robbed someone at gunpoint. This was in response to her own victimization. That in many ways we have to acknowledge in our work the ways in which our society and we as adults have taught young people to respond to their own trauma through violence and further victimization. And so the ways in which, for me, to address this work is to give our young people language such that they understand what they're feeling and that they can understand that the broader system of oppression that renders them invisible, that renders them vulnerable to further, sort of some of the issues that, Ken was saying about not feeling located in a space or connected to space these are all symptoms of a broader system of victimization and oppression that all of us need to better understand in order for us to build community to respond and feel safe. So the specific example that you gave when a harm has been committed between two individuals, I think, Fania, who's sitting right next to you, can help guide you in some specific conversations. And yes, she is on the restorative justice panel, and that is a promising space to begin to repair harm. But I also think that there's a broader conversation that we should be having about the ways in which we frame equity such that we understand that victimization is a core part of it, but also the healing from that victimization has to be a part of our language and our continued consciousness development as we start to structure interventions. And really, I'm just a fan, it feels so basic, but I'm just a fan of talking stuff through. And I think that it's important for us to teach our young people and to teach ourselves, reprogram ourselves, not to respond to every situation through a separation, right? You go over there, you're housed over here, without really trying to figure out a way to bring our communities back together. Because those kids that you named share a program. They probably share a community, right? We're talking about kids that share homes, that share schools, that share churches, that share parents sometimes. And so it's really important for us to think through how we begin to have core talking points in our community that facilitate this reconnection that's missing, because the absence of that connection is what produces and facilitates a space for greater harm to occur.
Yeah, I just want to very quickly just echo what's already been said, that in that little brief vignette I talked about in my talk about the kid in Florida, that in part was in the spirit of what your question's about, because at first glance, it's very easy to sort of focus on some horrific things that he did as a victimizer. But the lines are quite blurred, as folks have already said, and so that part of the other piece of that discourse is that long before he became a victimizer doing horrific things, he was also victimized. And there was a way in which that the light that was cast on him in the role of victimizer was nearly not as bright when he was victimized. And so there's a way in which I just think that part of the work and my definition of equity would be about how do we hold these two pieces together, that they're not two discrete, disparate entities, but they actually do inform each other in some pretty powerful ways. And I know in the trauma field there's this overused phrase, but I think it's significant, which is that this notion that hurt people hurt. And that there's a way in which and I was thinking that even around these conversations that I don't know, but like in the case you mentioned, it would have been interesting to know what would have happened, and that if somewhere along the way, prior to that experience, if there was conversations that person was involved in that had to do with these sort of trauma-informed types of questions, where there's some exploration about like what happened to you along the way. And then a question I always think is useful to ask in people is, who were you before you became who others say you are today? And even when there's a shrug of the shoulders, a slight elevation of the eyebrow, I don't know, my response is, make it up, fantasize, because I want them to see that how you're defined now does not necessarily have to constitute the totality of who you are. That at some point along the way, there was another story here that you got diverted from. And I think that's an important piece of the discourse as well.
Thank you.
The one piece that I would add is that I feel like the justice system is very good at punishing kids for their behavior and their treatment of the victim. And I think that there's disparate response, and I think that the construction of victims is gendered and racialized. And so I think that if you look at, on many, many levels, I think if you look at Charleston and the young man who killed 9 people, justifying his act by saying that the black community is taking over and that black men are rapists, is a exaggerated sense of danger by men of color. I think that gets transferred to young women of color who are masculinized anyway. But if you are a gender nonconforming young woman of color, in other words, a young woman who presents as more masculine, the punishment is also very exaggerated. And so Maria Torre does research in schools in New York City. She looked at the response of school resource officers towards gender nonconforming girls on campus. And what she did is she created a spectrum of responses by school resource officers, from verbal to physical. So you can imagine a verbal punishment versus a physical, physically pushing somebody against a wall and handcuffing them. And what she found is that for gender conforming girls of color, the majority of responses by school resource officers were verbal. The response to gender non-conforming girls of color were mostly physical, and for the same behaviors. And so, again, I just want to infuse the conversation with this idea that who is reinforcing what Ken and Monique are saying, and that there's a cycle, and that when we over-punish and when we over-respond to young people because of the perceived victimhood of who they've harmed, we are perpetuating the cycle, and we're not stopping it.
How many of people in this room have been victims of property crime or physical crime? I've been a victim of all of it, right? Living in my neighborhood. And so your question is right. And so I'm going to throw it back in a way that I think is the key. Because when we talk about this, all that you've heard are good rationales, but we as a country throw all of that out the window when somebody puts a gun in somebody's face and threatens them, or does even more harm and invades them sexually. Absolutely. And the justice system is totally geared up for that. And so I'm going to throw back this question. When you say the victim, what does the victim want? Do they want revenge, quote, accountability and sanctions? Or do they want to do more? Do we as a society think going forward, we're not going to excuse that act, but putting you in a 6x9 cell for 25 years and what that costs, it's not clear to me what we're getting. So the hard question before us is, what is justice and how is it perceived? We will never have agreement on this country, but I would submit to you that revenge, custody, suppression, and control for 400 years does not have the country feeling safer. And a recidivism rate of 60%. That victim doesn't want a 60% recidivism rate. I'm saying we have so many smart people. Can't we think of some other way to sanction that person so they never do that again, but we don't throw away their humanity? And I think we'll close with that. Thank you.